And still I rise, and today I rise with love of country at heart. And I rise to announce that I will not allow this issue to become so complicated that the American people might be confused. Because the truth is, we will be voting for one thing, whether we are for taxation without representation or whether we are against taxation without representation. It's really that simple. And as for me, I will be voting with the patriots. I will be voting with those patriots from 1773 who confronted the government. Those patriots who were there at the Boston Harbor. Those patriots who were there for the Boston Tea Party. I will be voting against taxation without representation. I believe that this is what the American Constitution and the American way is all about. Since 1773 it's been said, and today I will respect it with my vote. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in opposition to this unconstitutional measure. Our founders debated the merits of statehood and a federal district and rightly concluded that no state should have supremacy over others and enjoy considerable benefits and influence of also being our national headquarters. Our founders got it right. This measure gets it wrong. If D.C. surrenders the special status of our federal district and instead becomes one of 51 equals, why should it enjoy all the benefits of also being the federal district? Perhaps federal agencies like Energy or USDA should move to places like West Texas, where we actually produce food and fuel for the nation and beyond. Ambitions on the political left to expand the Supreme Court and U.S. Senate seats, limit the filibuster, keep 3 electoral votes for occupants of the White House, all while controlling our election law are one thing. They are for one thing, more power for them. Oppose this unconstitutional measure. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman from Texas yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
The gentleman describes, as many on the other side, this is at a political issue, a power grab. He cites all these other political actions. But the real power grab is denying 712,000 tax-paying American citizens the right to vote. That's the power grab. This isn't about politics. It's a fundamental voting and civil rights issue. And it is outrageous that Republicans would play partisan politics just to block 712,000 Americans from having full equality in our democracy. Every American deserves a voice in their government. Taxation without representation, fundamental beliefs in our democracy. I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Good.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the gentleman from Kentucky. I rise in opposition to this latest attempt by the Democrats to increase their power at the expense of longstanding American traditions and the Constitution. Sadly, this is not at all surprising. Democrats have made it clear that American institutions don't stand in their way of advancing their political agenda at all costs. They want to pack the Supreme Court, eliminate election integrity, defund our police, keep our borders open, and prohibit debate in this very House. And DC Statehood is just the next step. This legislation is an unconstitutional power grab designed to give Democrats more votes to pass their radical socialist agenda. As the Majority Leader just said, this is about 2 senators. It's not about principle. The District of Columbia has served as the federal district for over 200 years. The framers understood the importance of federal and state governments having separate authority and recognized that states would be ill-suited to house the federal government. And this was long before the Democrats started making everything about race. Now Democrats want to disregard the founders' vision, again, in order to grab 2 more votes in the Senate. Political advantage is no justification for policy that disregards precedent and the Constitution, and therefore I oppose this bill. And I yield my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Virginia, Chair of the Joint Economic Committee, Congressman Don Beyer.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in strong support of H.R. 51 and DC Statehood. My mother and father met at DC's Western High School in the 1940s before my father went off to West Point and Korea. I was raised in the Potomac Palisades of Washington and went to high school a few blocks from the Capitol. My grandchildren are fifth-generation Washingtonians. And through the generations, we've been confounded and confused that the United States citizens who live in the District of Columbia have been denied self-rule. The right to self-determination is the defining principle on which this nation was founded, and yet this very right is denied to those who reside in our nation's capital. Taxation without representation sparked our own war of independence from the Great Britain. Today, the same cry for democracy, impressed on every DC license plate, calls out for the peaceful passage of H.R. 51. The American citizens of the District of Columbia overwhelmingly support statehood, passing a statehood referendum with 85% support in 2016. My Republican statehood opponents argue that statehood should be denied D.C. because it is too small, because it is not rural enough, because it has insufficient logging, manufacturing, agriculture, or mining, because it is not well-rounded, and because its residents are not real Americans. D.C. does, by the way, have a Tesla car dealership. The real reason my Republican friends oppose statehood is that they disagree with the political views of today's Washingtonians. But this is terrible short-term thinking. Texas voted Democratic for generations, while California and New York have elected many Republican governors and senators. Political pendulums swing both ways. But this view betrays our democratic principles upon which our nation is founded. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from South Dakota, Mr. Johnson.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I am opposed to DC statehood, but I am not opposed to suffrage. If your goal is truly suffrage, rather than increasing Democratic control of the Senate, boy, do I have a plan for you. My bill would reunite the residential areas of the district with Maryland, as was done with Virginia in 1847. This plan would give full voting rights that we have heard so much about this morning, without ignoring the Constitution or the practical realities of what constitutes a state. And so I say to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, if your goal is truly suffrage, then let's do this together. Let's set aside the divisive rhetoric we have heard and work together to craft an appropriate and bipartisan solution to give representation to the people of D.C. Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
1 minute. 2? 1 minute, yeah. Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gomer.
Gentleman from Texas is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It was good to hear the majority leader say this is about politics. We knew that. But for some of us, it is about principle. And if it were about taxation without representation, I would have a slew of Democrats co-sponsoring the bill I've been filing for many terms to eliminate federal income tax in the District of Columbia. But I was told years ago, we're not going to join in with your bill because it'll weaken our chance to get a representative full voting from D.C. That's what this has been about. For some of us, principle is a big deal. When the Bush Justice Department was violating constitutional rights, some Republicans got furious. When the Obama administration did that, they circled the wagons and protected. This is about principle for some of us, and we got a tiny taste when the mayor of D.C., of an opposite party of President Trump, wasn't sure she was going to provide the police to protect the White House. This is about the Constitution and principle. Vote against this.
Gentleman yields back. A gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, may I inquire about the remaining time on both sides?
Gentlewoman has 5 minutes remaining. Gentleman from Kentucky has 10 minutes remaining.
I now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Michigan and chairwoman of the Committee on Science, Space, and Technology Subcommittee on Research Technology, Haley Stevens.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today in support of H.R. 51 in the esteemed tradition, the responsibility that we have of legislators of this body to evaluate adding a 51st state to this union, to form a more perfect union, yes, in the tradition and in the written words of our Constitution, because as when my native Michigan became the 26th state in 1837, added to this union, the president recognized that we will admit Michigan on equal footing. But we know that the founders and the originators of our beautiful nation did not know a Michigan when they were writing our Constitution. They did not know a Wyoming. And so we ask ourselves here as the ambassadors of democracy, what message we send to the world when we deny over 700,000 people the right to vote, when we tax them without the proper representation. This, my friends, is an exciting and profound and welcome day in this body that deserves debate, and this legislation deserves to pass. Thank you, and I yield back.
Yields back. Gentlewoman from New York reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. LaMalfa.
Gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I'm amazed at the smoke and mirrors and fog of obfuscation surrounding the debate on this bill. What Republicans are doing here today is defending the Constitution, what was put in place by the founders, that Washington, D.C., the district, would not be part of a state where it could be coerced or leveraged by a state to get things from it. I've just heard in the last few minutes solutions offered by two of my colleagues that could probably be passed in 6 weeks or less to allow what it is they claim they're saying for the citizens of Washington, D.C. Folding those 700,000 residents through a Maryland retrocession, as has happened with Virginia in 1846, would accomplish the goal of the same type of representation they're talking about. No, the politics is over on that side of the aisle because they have turned down a constitutional solution that this would be, instead for an unconstitutional one that flies in the face and produces a 66 square mile state that is 1/18 the size of Rhode Island, with the population just a little bit larger than the city of Fresno, California, because they want to accomplish a political goal while we defend the Constitution. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentlewoman from New York is recognized.
I reserve.
Gentlewoman reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Harris. I'm sorry.
Gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I guess it's appropriate for someone from Maryland to speak on this issue because this is Maryland's land we're talking about. This land was given for the purpose of a federal enclave by Maryland. How dare the Congress take Maryland's land from it? That's not why it was given. But, Mr. Speaker, let's talk about the unconstitutional. Well, you have heard about the unconstitutionality. We don't need to talk about it anymore. I urge everyone who's watching us on C-SPAN today, go get your copy of the Constitution. It's written in black and white. This is very plain. This is clearly unconstitutional. But, Mr. Speaker, I hope America was paying attention to the majority leader's speech. That one line where he said, this is all about politics. In fact, he even gave the history. He said, well, in the past, the Republicans wanted senators and so wanted senators, so they made... We don't live in the past. We live in the present. Mr. Speaker, is this what America wants? Do they want pure politics? That's what not my words. That's what the majority leader said. This is all about politics. Now, Mr. Speaker, let's ask, why did our founders do what they did? Every American who's watching, think about what you saw last summer. You saw a White House under siege. You saw